We went from March 9th or so. President Trump said he came to the podium with the task force and said that this is just like a common cold. We're not going to do anything about it, no lockdowns, no anything, because that was what was being discussed. And then on March, I believe, a few days after, about March 10th, in a 24-hour period, President Trump came back onto the podium and said, we may, we're looking at some issues we might be considering. Then on March 15th was the real hammer day when POTUS Trump came onto the task force, came onto the podium with the task force and said that essentially we're going to lock down. Well, Fauci said it. And I put out a Substack where Alexander COVID News, where at about a minute into that short podium talk, Trump seemed to have been distracted by somebody in the audience. And when Fauci said that we were locking down and things would be closed, Trump actually didn't hear that, because when he came back to the podium to speak and he was asked by the interviewer, by one of the media, he said, well, we haven't decided, I'm paraphrasing, so don't quote me verbatim. He said, we haven't decided fully, but it's something we're looking at. So,
okay. So I don't to interrupt, but I want to stop there with that point in time, that point in history. Because,
very critical, that was it.
Right, and I remember seeing feed come up that there were talks about the lockdown. It was a 2 weeks to slow the spread. And then there was conversations coming in where the schools were going to be closed down, businesses, only essential workers were to report. And that was really, the jumping off point of, a major fallout that ensued. And even today, how many years later, we're still talking about the implications of that. So back to when you believe that Trump didn't actually hear when Fauci said we're going to lock things down. Take us back to that point.
Well, I think, again, Mayor Deb, it's an astute observation. And here's the key, and here's what the listener should understand, is that as to that moment in time, President Trump on March 15, 2020, March 16th, that press conference changed this world and damaged us.
Absolutely.
Because at that point in the presser, when Burks had allowed Fauci to come and clean up something she said, and then he read that everything shall be closed. Trump didn't hear that. So much so that when Fauci moved off of the podium, Trump came to the podium, and then when the reporter, I think it was CNN or ABC, asked him, so Mr. President, are you again I'm using are you saying that everything will be shut down now? And he said, well, we haven't really decided that. But what President Trump didn't understand is Fauci just said it was over. And what is key that what Mayor Deb just asked is this. Deborah Burks wrote in her book, and she has interviewed about this, and you should know that Deborah Burks and me were like enemies there when I was at the HHS, because I was going after Fauci and her and all of their lunacy with the lockdowns and the school closures. She actually wrote that she hated me. She despised me and Dr. Scott Atlas because we were actually following the science. Nobody in that task force, President Trump's task force, followed any science. We would be in meetings where Dr. Atlas would walk in, Dr. Atlas would have a pile of studies that we consulting, we discussing, and they would walk into the meeting with nothing. And they were ill-informed. It was never evidence-based. It was never science for them. And Burke said, and this is what the population needs to understand. There are a lot of people talk about Vice President Pence, his role in equipping President Trump's task force. Trump said he inherited these people through Pence, etc. But what people need to understand is Burks wrote that me and Tony et al., we were concocting going to the president to get the lockdowns. But we knew he wasn't going to agree. So we came up with a scheme with this term to bend the curve for 2 weeks. But we know on Burks, and this is written and she stated it, and this is what should outrage the population, because this really ransacked society and the entire world, and many people died. Many children committed suicide and business owners. She said, as we knew that when we went into the office, the Oval, and we made the case and told POTUS Trump that he has to shut it down, he would react and say under no condition, because at that point, we had an economy with 3.3, 3.4% unemployment. The best economy in the world. Trump deserves a lot of credit for that. All of the groups, blacks, Latinos, women, everybody was working. America was humming along and Trump was on pace. I knew the data. The internal polls were showing Trump was on pace for about approximately 40 of the states with about 350 to 380 electoral votes. Unstoppable. She said, we will tell him, give us 2 weeks to bend the curve. He will think, President Trump, they were deceiving him. That's why these people must be tried in courts.
Okay, so let me stop you there. So they knew, it sounds like full well, that the 2 weeks was just the bait to get Trump to bite.
It was a lie.
They knew that once they had him at 2 weeks, they weren't going to open things up after 2 weeks.
Correct.
They were going to keep things closed. So the general population was being told was fooled, because we all thought after 2 weeks we're going to go through this lockdown. We're going to close everything down, our schools, our businesses, our lifestyles, and after 2 weeks we're going to open everything back up to normal because we've slowed, put a bend in the curve. And in reality, what you're saying is that was never the intention to open things up after 2 weeks.
Well, if you remember, President Trump came to the podium and told us, told you, that by Easter we'll be open and we will have our barbecues and our, he said
our
so.
Celebrations, yeah.
Celebrations. But Deborah Burks and they were echoing a different song. They were saying, we just need him to bite for this 2 weeks. He doesn't know. She said this. She said he doesn't know we will never reopen. But we just needed him to bite. And once he bit for 2 weeks, he will never be able, and this is what the population needs to understand, the con and the lie and the deceit to President Trump. That's why when I write and I speak, and people say, well, Dr. Alexander, you don't think that President Trump was in on this? No. He was badly deceived because he thought, begrudgingly, because his gut instinct, we knew, even Atlas wrote in his book that Trump's gut instinct was to not lock down, and he said so. But when they made the case to him and Pence and they 2 weeks to bend the curve, Burks and they knew that they were misleading and deceiving, they were conning him. He didn't know that. So when he agreed to the 2 weeks to stop the economy, he felt that in 2 weeks we could get back on stream and hit the road running. But we quickly had data that showed us, me, Scott, that with every 1% increase in unemployment in America, we were beginning to get information that 1.3% increase in suicide rate. So we were pegging the unemployment. So we said, well, look, as he locked down, unemployment jumped to 20%, then to 25%, because everything was closed. We knew that it would translate into every 1%, 1.3% increase in suicide. So that was a huge problem. That's why Trump was anxious to get it back open, and that's why he was fighting behind the scenes. But Burks and Fauci and Azar and that task force saved Brett Gerard. Brett Gerard, I think, was probably the most legitimate out of all, and I worked with him and I knew him. Caputo I worked for and with fought to reopen the society. We knew that they lied to Trump. Trump didn't quite understand the lie. Burks said that once he gave us the 2 weeks, he could not come back to the podium and tell the nation, and this is what Trump was in trouble. Because after the 2 weeks, he said, well, okay, we're going to open up now. They told him, how are you going to do that, Mr. President? You're going to go out on that stage and go against me and Fauci and Redfield? And that was Trump's problem. I want to...
And that's a problem, because Trump is not a trained doctor.
No.
Like Fauci or Burks. And for him then to have gone out on that stage, what would that have looked like?
You made them. I would have wanted him 25th Amendment, because we were still trying to wrap our heads around the parameters of whatever this was. You know, WHO was talking about 3.4% mortality. That's a serious issue. 3.4% because seasonal influenza, the mortality rate is about 0.1. And it's still heavy enough. So 3.4% is like 35-fold. So we knew if this was true, we would lose a lot of people. But it was never true. John Ioannidis, Stanford, almost 1 month out of the gate, did a modeling, did probably the best science and published. I've written about this. I know John, excellent, brilliant guy. He worked out that the infection fatality rate, which is the purest metric, not the mortality rate, the infection fatality rate, because it uses the right numbers in the numerator and the denominator of the equation, showed that the actual infection fatality was 0.05%, means corrected 0.04% for persons 0 to 70, 0 to 75. That means that your risk of survival, 1 month out, we knew, 2 weeks, 1 month. So by about the beginning of April, we knew that your risk of survival from 0 years old to 75 years old, if you were exposed to whatever this was, if you want to accept it as a coronavirus, bat coronavirus, toxin, poison, whatever that caused these respiratory, pulmonary type symptoms, we knew that your chance of survival, your risk of survival, was 99.9998%. Because they knew, Fauci and Bergson, they decided that once Trump bit the 2 weeks, he could not, as a non-doctor, non-scientist, come to that podium and tell the rest of the population, look, I just told these people behind the scenes to open up, open schools, it's over. They would have come to the podium. They told him we would leak it. We would leak that you muzzling us. And the public would be outraged that you, a New York developer, building buildings, coming on this stage with 6 doctors and scientists behind you, and the rest of academia and the rest of the scientists saying, everybody hiding in their basement believing this garbage. You telling everybody open up, so you're going to risk the lives of the whole of America and all of our children will die. So he knew they had him. They had him. He was stunned. He couldn't get out of it. They had him as long as they wanted. And that was Trump's problem, because even when I was at HHS, my bosses, we'd sit down in meetings with Fauci and his team. And Fauci would be going on media and we'd be talking to him about what he's doing, what he's saying, blah, 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 to make sure it coincides with what President Trump was saying on his stump, because remember, we were talking election year. And Fauci and his team would tell us that I am going to do this, that, and the other. And if you don't let me, Anthony Fauci, the nation's doctor, go and say what I want, I will leak, we will leak that you muzzling us. So President Trump had that threat from Fauci every single day. And we were dealing with that in the media. And they did it once or twice, and it took us 2 weeks to get that out in the media. It was always a lie. Nobody ever muzzled anyone. Fauci and they had free reign, but they would threaten us. And so with that 2 weeks to bend the curve, remember what happened then? Give us now a month. Give us now 45 more days. And we just never opened. All the while, children were, listen, we had mothers and fathers turning up to the ER. Why? The media wouldn't tell you this. I've spoken about this before and written. Mothers and fathers turn up telling the doctor, the mother is saying, it's been 8 months, 9 months, 10 months, I haven't worked. I have no income. The company I'm working with just closed. I have no job to go back to. And I've been physically violent, beating my husband. Physically. And he's standing up to the ER doctor saying, doctor, and this happened across America because Atlas and myself, we were getting the data rolled up to us from the States and we were informing the White House. That is why Trump was behind the scenes hammering Fauci. And sometimes you saw him on the podium telling them, turning to them saying, open up, open the schools. Because the husband would turn to the doctor and say, but doctor, shamefully, my wife is right. She's been physically violent against me. But I have been equally violent against her. I've been physically beating her every day because I'm miserable, I'm angry. She can't work, I can't work. But today we think we killed the child.